Hey, it's Matt. I'm back with a different sort of watercolor for me. This is plant painting. I've done a lot of plants in recent history. This is a 9 by 24 inch transparent watercolor. I got most of the photos from these using 100 millimeter macro at various orchid shows or of my own orchid specimens. And then I kind of composited all of these and spent a lot of time designing it in Photoshop, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I solved a lot of those problems on the computer before I went about painting. Once I had the basic layout figured out, I printed out the good version, and then I transferred all these sketches onto the watercolor paper so I could have a good clean start to go with. A bit of a departure for me, I ended up doing the circles first, so I knew that those would be crisp and clean. And these were done with India ink, so it was waterproof, and then the crescents of circle were done with a scribing nib on the compass. Once I had those things down and they were nice and sharp, I went about bringing in and doing the watercolors of each one of these. Normally when I do watercolors, I try to bring the entire painting up together as a whole. And in this one, since they were individual little paintings, it was like doing 21 little miniature paintings, or 23, I forget how many there were in this, but all these little individual pieces, and then I painted those to about the same level of completion, I hope. That allowed me to keep the paper really clean because I could cover up all that white of the page and not worry about dripping paint on it. If I were moving from one to the other a little bit at a time, I might have messed it up a little bit. This allowed me to keep it clean. Almost all the work was done with a really sharp number 2 round brush for these. Some of the larger areas I did with a 4 and a 6 round. Interspersed with these little macro images, I did 2 specimens of orchids, and I'd done botanical illustration in the past, and I kind of wanted to avoid doing a strict botanical illustration because, I don't know, I wanted to do something that was a little more lively and a little less rigid, so I came up with this design to keep it interesting for myself. And so I had these little circular macro shots and then 2 of the actual specimens. And then within those I was a little afraid that if I just had the circles and the specimens, that wouldn't tie it together. So I ended up bringing in these larger partial circles of color to tie all these elements together. And those used colors that are within the individual orchids that got painted. And I thought it was a fun way to bring everything together and bring that circular motif back, and tie in the specimens that were painted as well. Most of the work was done with a number 2 brush. Some of the larger areas I do with number 6 or a number 4 round. But I'd say the majority of it was done with the number 2. And some went faster than others. With if you had these large flat areas like on the white orchid that I'm working on now, those went pretty quickly. But with some of the patterns with all the dots and streaks and things like that, it really slowed you down. It took a lot more time. It was a fun change from my usual subject matter of birds and bugs and things like that. This was probably my favorite one to work on with all these pink, freckly kind of patterns too. It was just a beautiful orchid. And part of my reasoning with doing the close-ups was to kind of appreciate the similarity and variations on the theme of the kind of architecture of these flowers. That they're in ways very different, but they have similar structures, and they have these beautiful curves and patterns that kind of play together nicely. And I thought by kind of having these macro circular things that would kind of bring them together in a fun way. At this point, I was actually doing two of these kind of about the same time because they were so near each other. I wasn't afraid of getting the paper dirty. I almost never use white backgrounds. I kind of find them boring. If I use white, I want it to be a distinct choice, not just a kind of a default. And with this one, the whites seem to make sense in that a lot of botanical work's done on white, but I wanted to push it away from that, but I guess not totally ignore the history of those, the presentation of those paintings or illustrations. So white seemed like a good way to go, and having these little colors tying things together would be a fun way to not just have a blank white of the page, but kind of have things work across it in an interesting way. And this green one was so cool. It looked like a pitcher's plant almost, with the mouth parts on it. And it was a fun one to paint. I think my uncle had one similar to this at one point. He's a big orchid fan. He has a large collection that, as a kid, always inspired me to, just all these plants I didn't even know existed, and get to go over and see the great things that he had, worked so hard to keep going. This one was one of my orchids. It was a little kind of a peppermint kind of striped pattern to it. This was fun to paint. It's amazing how many reds and pinks you end up using in rendering those to get them to look right. I think total time spent on painting was it was over 30 hours. It was probably like 35, 36 hours just painting. That doesn't include all the, sketching, transferring, and designing the thing. Designing this took forever. A lot longer than I'd like to admit. In the end, it looks fairly simple, but to get here, I went through a lot of versions that I don't think would have been as successful. Or at least for me, is interesting. Now we're in the home stretch. Once I've kind of picked away at these last details of the final orchid, I spent a bit of time just going and cleaning up the edges of the circles where when I used the compass and the scribe, that they weren't quite even, or for the watercolor edges where I wanted to just tidy those up, and a little bit of picking around, and I called it done. So there you go, the 9x24" transparent watercolor of orchids. Hope you liked it. If you have a chance, have a peek at the blog or the website.